Sleep paralysis affects millions of people worldwide. That horrifying moment when you're conscious but can't move, often accompanied by shadowy figures or crushing sensations. Most doctors call it a harmless sleep disorder, but sometimes what happens during those frozen moments suggests something far more sinister is at work. These are 5 allegedly true accounts of sleep paralysis that didn't just paralyze bodies. They revealed doorways to something that should have stayed closed. My name is Marcus, and I need to share what happened to me last spring in my studio apartment in downtown Portland. I've been dealing with sleep paralysis on and off since college, maybe once every few months. The usual stuff: can't move, feel like someone's watching, panic until it passes. Nothing I couldn't handle. But in March of 2024, something changed. I was working late shifts at a call center, getting home around 2 a.m. most nights. The building was old, probably built in the 1940s, with thin walls and creaky floors. My unit was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the parking lot and a small courtyard that nobody used. The rent was cheap, which should have been my first warning sign. The building had that distinctive smell old places get, a mixture of decades of cooking, cleaning products, and something else I could never quite identify. Musty, but not unpleasant. The hallways were narrow, with outdated carpet that had probably been burgundy once, but had faded to a dull brown. Each apartment door was painted the same institutional beige, with brass numbers that had tarnished over the years. My apartment was small but functional. A Murphy bed that I rarely bothered to fold up, a kitchenette with appliances from the 1980s, and a single window that looked out over the courtyard. The bathroom was tiny, with a shower that only had hot water if you caught it at the right time of day. But for someone working overnight shifts and sleeping during the day, it was perfect. The first incident happened on a Tuesday. I'd fallen asleep watching Netflix on my couch, still in my work clothes. I remember the episode one was watching, some crime documentary about missing persons cases. Ironic, considering what was about to happen. Around 4 a.m., I woke up in that familiar paralyzed state. But this time, I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door, not just passing by. They stopped right outside my unit. If you experience sleep paralysis, hit that subscribe button. You're not alone in this terrifying experience. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, like someone wearing work boots. They had a rhythm to them, almost like pacing, back and forth, back and forth. I tried call out, but my voice wouldn't work. My throat felt like it was filled with sand. Then came 3 deliberate knocks on my door. Not the quick rap, rap, rap of someone in a hurry. These were slow, measured. Knock, knock, knock. Each one seemed to reverberate through my apartment, through my chest, through my bones. When the paralysis broke, I jumped up and looked through the peephole. Empty hallway. The fluorescent light above was flickering like it always did, casting weird shadows on the opposite wall. I checked my phone for 4:17 a.m. I'd been paralyzed for what felt like hours, but it had only been a few minutes. I checked with my neighbor the next day, Mrs. Chun, who's lived here for 15 years. She was in her 70s, originally from Taiwan, and had that no-nonsense attitude that comes from decades of city living. She kept her door chained and rarely spoke to anyone in the building. Knocking, she said, looking at me through her barely open door. No, I didn't hear anything unusual that night. But then again, I take my sleeping pills at 10 p.m. sharp. Nothing wakes me up after that. I thought maybe it was just stress. Working nights messes with your brain chemistry. Plus, I've been having some financial troubles. My car had broken down the week before, and I was behind on my student loans. Stress can cause all kinds of weird symptoms. But the episodes started happening every few nights. Always the same pattern. Footsteps, pacing, 3 knocks. But they were getting longer. What used to last maybe 30 seconds now stretched to several minutes. And during that time, I started noticing details I shouldn't have been able to see. During one episode, I could somehow see through my apartment door into the hallway. I know how that sounds, impossible, right? But I could see the burgundy carpet, the flickering fluorescent light, the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall across from my door. And there was a figure standing there. Tall, wear what looked like a maintenance uniform, the kind with a name patch and everything. But the face was wrong, blurred, like someone had smeared it with their thumb, or like I was looking at it through frosted glass. I started keeping a journal, documenting every episode, the dates, times, what I saw and heard. I'm naturally analytical. It's why I was good at my call center job. I like solving problems, finding patterns. After 2 weeks, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figure was getting clearer each time. By the end of March, I could make out details that terrified me. The maintenance uniform was navy blue with a company logo I didn't recognize. The figure was middle-aged, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and calloused hands. He wore a tool belt with various implements, screwdrivers, pliers, a small flashlight, but it was his expression that haunted me. He looked frustrated, like he was trying to tell me something important, but couldn't find the words. During one particularly long episode, he pointed toward my window, not casually, but urgently, like he was trying to direct my attention to something crucial. I decided to research my building's history. The Portland Public Library has an extensive archive of local newspapers and city records. I spent my afternoon off digging through microfiche and old building permits, looking for anything that might explain what I was experiencing. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about sleep paralysis. In 1987, a maintenance worker named David Keller had died in this building, not from an accident. He had a heart attack while working a night shift, fixing a heating issue on the 3rd floor. The newspaper article was brief, buried on page 7 of the local section. Maintenance worker dies on job. David Keller, 52, of Portland, died Tuesday night while performing routine maintenance at the Hawthorne Arms apartment building. Keller, who had worked for Morrison Property Management for 8 years, was found Wednesday morning in the hallway outside apartment 3C. The cause of death was determined to be a massive heart attack. Keller is survived by his wife, Margaret, and 2 adult children. Services will be held at Sunset Memorial Gardens. My apartment was 3C. The article mentioned that David had been known for his methodical approach to work. According to his supervisor, he'd always knock 3 times before entering a unit, even when tenants weren't home. It was a signature habit, something he'd done since his early days in maintenance. David was old school. The supervisor was quoted as saying he believed in treating people's homes with respect. I showed the article to Mrs. Chun. Her face went pale as she read it. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I remember him. David. He was such a nice man. Always polite. Always knock before coming in. He fixed my garbage disposal once. Wouldn't take a tip." Then she told me something that made my skin crawl. For years after David's death, residents reported hearing knocking at night. Always 3 knocks. Always around the same time. The management company changed the locks, installed better security, even hired a night watchman for a while. But the knocking continued. She paused, looking out into the hallway nervously. It stopped about 5 years ago. We all thought, we thought maybe he'd found peace. But David hadn't found peace. He was trying to tell me something. Something about what he'd seen the night he died. That night, I didn't want to sleep. I stayed up playing video games, drinking coffee, anything to avoid another episode. But around 3 a.m., exhaustion won. This time, the paralysis was different. I could feel someone sitting on the edge of my bed, the mattress depressing under their weight. I could smell machine oil and old cigarettes. The scent was so vivid, so specific, that I knew this wasn't just my imagination. When I managed to open my eyes, David was sitting there, clearer than ever before. He looked exactly like the newspaper description, middle-aged, with tired eyes and work-stained fingers. His uniform had a name patch that read David K. in red cursive letters. He turned to look at me, and I could see his face now. Really see it. He had kind eyes, the kind that belonged to someone who'd spent his life helping others. But there was something else there too. Urgency, desperation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked frustrated, like he was trying to tell me something important, but couldn't find the words. He kept pointing toward my window, more insistently now. Then he stood up and walked toward the window. I watched, paralyzed, as he pressed his palm against the glass and looked down at the courtyard below. He turned back to me, and I could see tears in his eyes. When the paralysis broke, I rushed to the window. The courtyard was empty, illuminated by a single security light. But now, looking down from my window, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. There was a rectangular patch of concrete that looked newer than the rest. It was roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, about the size of a grave. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about David pointing toward my window. I'd lived here for 8 months and never paid much attention to the courtyard below. It was just a small concrete space surrounded by the building's walls, with a few dead plants and some broken lawn chairs that had been there since I moved in. But now in the daylight, I could see details I'd missed before. The courtyard was maybe 20 feet by 15 feet, enclosed on 3 sides by the building's walls, and open to the parking lot on the 4th side. There was a small drainage grate in one corner, and someone had painted a faded hopscotch pattern on the concrete years ago. And there, in the center, was that rectangular patch of newer concrete. It was subtle. You'd have to know what to look for, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The color was slightly different, a shade lighter than the surrounding concrete. The texture was different too, smoother, like it had been poured more recently. I called the building management company and asked about the courtyard's history. After being transferred 3 times, I finally spoke to someone who'd worked there in the 1980s. "Oh, that courtyard," she said. Her name was Linda, and she had the world-weary voice of someone who'd been dealing with tenant complaints for decades. "Yeah, we had to pour new concrete there in '88. Some kind of structural issue. Had to dig pretty deep to fix it. That was a year after David's death." "What kind of structural issue?" I pressed. "Oh, old buildings. Probably something with the foundation. Or maybe a water main." It was so long ago, I don't really remember the details. But something in her voice suggested she remembered more than she was letting on. I started researching missing persons reports from that time period. The Portland Police Bureau has an online database that goes back to the 1980s. I searched for disappearances in the area around the time David died. What I found made me understand why David kept trying to communicate. In late 1987, just 2 months after David's death, a young woman named Lisa Chun had disappeared. She'd been visiting her mother when she vanished. The police report said she'd gone for a walk around 11 p.m. and never returned. Her car was found in the parking lot of my building the next morning. Lisa Chun, Mrs. Chun had never mentioned having a daughter. Make sure you're subscribed for the shocking revelation about what really happened to Lisa Chun. The missing person report was detailed. Lisa was 23 years old, a recent college graduate who'd been struggling with drug addiction. She'd been staying with her mother, trying to get clean. The report mentioned that she'd been receiving threats from someone connected to her drug use, but no specific names were given. There was a photo attached to the report. Lisa looked exactly like her mother, but younger. Same intelligent eyes, same determined expression. She was beautiful, with long black hair and a bright smile. The kind of person you'd remember if you met her. The investigation had gone cold after a few months. No witnesses, no leads, no body. Lisa Chun had simply vanished. But David had been working late that night. He'd seen something in the courtyard, something that had stopped his heart. I spent the next day gathering more information. I visited the Portland Police Bureau and requested copies of all reports related to Lisa Chun's disappearance. The detective who'd handled the case was long retired, but his notes were thorough. According to the file, Lisa had been staying with her mother at the Hawthorne Arms for 3 weeks before her disappearance. She'd been clean for 2 months, attending NA meetings, looking for work. But someone had been calling the apartment, threatening her. Mrs. Chun had reported the calls to the police, but they couldn't trace them. On the night Lisa disappeared, she'd gotten another call around 10:30 p.m. Mrs. Chun told police that Lisa had seemed scared, but she'd insisted on going for a walk to clear her head. She'd never come back. The file included interview notes with building residents. Most people said they'd seen Lisa around but didn't know her well. She was quiet, kept to herself, always polite when she passed people in the hallway. But one interview stood out. A resident named Martha Williams, who'd lived on the second floor, reported hearing voices in the courtyard around midnight. She looked out her window but couldn't see anything because of the angle. She'd heard what sounded like an argument, then silence. Martha Williams had moved out 2 weeks later. I found Martha's forwarding address in the building's records. She'd moved to a retirement community in Beaverton, about 30 minutes away. I called the main number and asked to speak with her. Martha Williams? The receptionist said. Oh, honey, Martha passed away about 3 years ago, but her son visits sometimes. Would you like me to give him a message? I left my contact information and got a call back that evening. Martha's son, Robert, was curious about why someone was asking about his mother's time at the Hawthorne Arms. Mom never talked much about that place, he said, but I know something happened there that really shook her up. She lived in that building for 5 years. Then suddenly she wanted to move, said she couldn't sleep there anymore. I explained what I was researching, without mentioning the supernatural aspects. Robert was quiet for a long moment. You know, after Mom moved out, she used to have nightmares about that courtyard. She'd wake up screaming about someone being buried alive. I thought it was just stress from the move, but Mom was pretty sharp. She wasn't the type to make things up. Robert agreed to let me look through his mother's belongings. She kept some papers from her time at the Hawthorne Arms, including a journal she'd started keeping after Lisa's disappearance. The journal entries were disturbing. Martha had become convinced that Lisa hadn't run away. She'd been murdered. She'd started documenting strange things she observed in the building. Residents moving out suddenly, maintenance work being done at odd hours, and the management company's evasive answers about the courtyard renovation. One entry, dated January 15th, 1988, read, "They poured new concrete in the courtyard today." Said it was a foundation issue, but I saw them digging. That hole was deep, maybe 6 feet. And the way they worked, fast, nervous, like they were trying to hide something. I keep thinking about that poor girl. Where did she go? Why won't anyone talk about her? Armed with Martha's journal and the police reports, I decided to confront Mrs. Chin directly. I knocked on her door on a Thursday evening, when I knew she'd be home from her part-time job at the grocery store. She opened the door with her usual caution, chain still attached. "Mrs. Chun, I need to talk to you about Lisa." Her face went white. For a moment, I thought she might close the door on me. But then she sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. I wondered when someone would come asking about her. She let me in. Her apartment was exactly what I'd expected, neat, sparse, with furniture that looked like it came from the 1980s. There were no family photos anywhere, which I now understood was deliberate. Lisa was my daughter, she said, settling into a worn armchair. My only child. She was brilliant, you know, graduated from Portland State with honors. But she got mixed up with the wrong crowd, started using drugs. Heroin, mostly. Mrs. Chen's voice was steady, but I could see the pain in her eyes. She came to stay with me in the fall of '87. She was trying to get clean, really trying. For a while, I thought we were going to make it. She was going to meetings, looking for work. She seemed hopeful, but someone was threatening her, I said. Mrs. Chen nodded. A man named Tony Marchetti. He was her dealer, but he was more than that. He owned her, you know? He'd loaned her money, got her into debt. When she tried to get clean, he wouldn't let her go. She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the courtyard. He called every few days. Said if she didn't come back, he hurt her. Hurt me. I told her to go to the police, but she was scared. Said Tony had connections, that the police couldn't protect us. What happened the night she disappeared? Mrs. Chin was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Tony called around 10:30. I answered the phone. He said he was in the parking lot, that he wanted to talk to Lisa. She was terrified, but she said she had to go. Said maybe she could reason with him. Did you see her leave? I watched from my window. She went down to the courtyard. Tony was there, waiting. They talked for a few minutes. Then, she paused, her hand shaking slightly. Then he grabbed her. She screamed, but it was late. No one came to help. The truth about what happened to Lisa Chun will shock you. Make sure you're subscribed for the conclusion. Mrs. Chun, did you see what happened next? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. He hit her, hard. She fell down and didn't get back up. I should have called the police right then, but I was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then what happened? Tony looked around, like he was checking if anyone had seen. Then he dragged her body to the corner of the courtyard. He had a shovel in his car. He started digging. I felt sick. He buried her there. It took him hours. I watched the whole thing. I should have done something, should have called for help, but I was terrified. Tony had said he'd kill me if I interfered, and Lisa was already dead. I told myself there was nothing I could do, but someone did see. I said, David Keller. Mrs. Chun looked at me with surprise. The maintenance man? How did you know? He's been trying to tell me. Through sleep paralysis episodes. He's been showing me the courtyard, trying to get me to understand what happened. Mrs. Chun stared at me like I'd lost my mind, but then she seemed to consider it. David was working late that night. He'd been fixing the heating system in the basement. Around 2 a.m., he came upstairs to check on something. He must have seen Tony finishing up. What happened when David saw him? Tony was putting the shovel back in his car when David came out of the building. David asked what he was doing. Tony said he was just checking on his girlfriend, that everything was fine. But David was suspicious. He said he was going to call the police. Mrs. Chun walked back to her chair, looking exhausted. Tony couldn't let that happen. He attacked David, right there in the hallway. David was older, out of shape. The stress, the physical altercation. His heart couldn't take it. He collapsed. And Tony just left him there? What else could he do? David was already dead. Tony got his car and drove away. I never saw him again. I spent the next several days processing what Mrs. Chun had told me. The weight of it was overwhelming. For 37 years, she'd been carrying this secret. Lisa's body was literally beneath our feet, and David had died trying to save her. But I needed more than just Mrs. Chen's story. I needed evidence. I started researching Tony Marchetti. It took some digging, but I found records of him in the Portland police database. He'd been arrested multiple times in the 1980s for drug dealing, but nothing had stuck. He had connections, just like Lisa had said. In 1989, 2 years after Lisa's disappearance, Tony had been found dead in his apartment. The cause of death was listed as a drug overdose, but the circumstances were suspicious. He'd been shot once in the head, and the gun was placed in his hand afterward. Someone had wanted Tony Marchetti dead. Someone who knew what he'd done. I found a detective who'd investigated Tony's death. He was retired now, living in a small town outside Portland. When I called him, he remembered the case immediately. Tony Marchetti, he said. Yeah, that was a weird one. Looked like suicide, but it felt wrong. Tony was left-handed, but the gun was in his right hand, and he'd been making moves to leave town, like he was running from something. I explained what I was investigating. The detective was quiet for a long moment. You know, we always suspected Tony was involved in more than just drug dealing. There were rumors about girls going missing, but we could never prove anything. If what you're saying is true, would you be willing to look into it? Son, I've been retired for 15 years, but I still have contacts in the department. And if there's a body buried in that courtyard, it needs to be found. Getting the Portland Police Bureau to take my claims seriously was harder than I'd expected. The detective I had spoken with, retired Detective Frank Morrison, had to call in several favors to get someone to listen. Finally, I was put in touch with Detective Sarah Kim, who specialized in cold cases. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of tired eyes that came from years of dealing with the worst of humanity. Mr. Johnson, she said when we met at a coffee shop near the police station. Frank Morrison says you have information about a 1987 missing persons case. I told her everything. About the sleep paralysis episodes, about David Keller, about Mrs. Chen's confession. I showed her Martha Williams' journal, the police reports, the newspaper articles. Detective Kim listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. This is a lot to process, she said finally. The supernatural elements aside, If what you're saying is true, we're talking about a murder that's been covered up for nearly 4 decades. Mrs. Chun is willing to make a formal statement, I said. She's tired of carrying the secret. And you really believe this David Keller has been communicating with you? I knew how it sounded, but I'd lived through it. I know how crazy it sounds. But he's been trying to tell me where Lisa is buried. He died trying to save her, and he can't rest until she's found. Detective Kim studied me for a moment. You know, in 30 years of police work, I've seen things that can't be explained. I've had cases where victims' families had dreams that led to evidence. I've seen witnesses come forward years later because something compelled them to speak up. She paused and made a decision. I'll need to interview Mrs. Chin formally, and I'll need to get approval for ground-penetrating radar in that courtyard. If there's a body there, we'll find it. What the ground-penetrating radar revealed will change everything you think you know about the supernatural. The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Mrs. Chin gave a formal statement to Detective Kim, describing everything she'd witnessed that night in 1987. She was scared, but she was also relieved. 37 years of guilt was finally being lifted from her shoulders. The management company was initially resistant to allowing the police to search the courtyard. They were worried about liability, about the effect on property values. But Detective Kim had a way of being very persuasive. You can cooperate voluntarily, she told them, or I can get a warrant. Either way, we're going to search that courtyard. They chose to cooperate. The ground-penetrating radar team arrived on a Tuesday morning. I watched from my window as they set up their equipment. The machine looked like a large lawnmower with a computer attached. They moved it slowly across the courtyard, recording readings. It took less than an hour to find what they were looking for. There's definitely something down there, the technician told Detective Kim. About 6 feet down, in the center of the courtyard. It's the right size and shape to be human remains. Detective Kim looked up at my window. I could see her making a decision. We'll need to excavate, she said. I'll get a team together for tomorrow morning. The excavation began at dawn. I'd taken the day off work to watch. Mrs. Chin stood at her window, finally ready to face what she'd been running from for 37 years. The new concrete was only about 4 inches thick, just enough to cover what was underneath. When they broke through it, the smell hit everyone immediately. Even after all these years, there was still an odor. Detective Kim ordered everyone except the medical examiner's team to step back. They worked carefully, using brushes and small tools to remove the dirt. It was slow, painstaking work. Around noon, they found the first bone. We've got remains, the medical examiner announced. Appears to be a complete skeleton, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall. Female, based on the pelvic structure. As they continued excavating, they found more than just bones. There were fragments of clothing, a blue sweater, jeans, sneakers. And there was jewelry, a small gold necklace with a pendant that read, Lisa. Mrs. Chun broke down crying when she saw it. I gave that to her for her 16th birthday, she whispered. But the most important discovery came last. Wrapped in a plastic bag and buried with the body was Lisa's purse. Inside, they found her driver's license, some cash, and a small notebook. The notebook contained names, dates, and dollar amounts. Lisa had been keeping records of her drug transactions, including detailed notes about Tony Marchetti's operation. She'd been planning to turn him in. This is why he killed her, Detective Kim said. She wasn't just trying to get clean. She was going to expose him. The discovery of Lisa Chen's body reopened not just her case, but several others. The notebook in her purse contained information about other missing women, other victims of Tony Marchetti's operation. Detective Kim's team started connecting dots that had been invisible for nearly 4 decades. 3 other women who disappeared in the late 1980s had connections to Tony Marchetti. With Lisa's notebook as a guide, they were able to solve cases that had been cold for decades. But Tony Marchetti was beyond earthly justice. He'd been dead for 35 years, likely killed by someone higher up in the drug organization who was tired of the heat he was bringing down on them. The real justice came in the form of closure. Lisa Chen finally received the funeral she deserved. The service was held at the same church where David Keller had been memorialized 37 years earlier. Mrs. Chun spoke at the service. She talked about the daughter she'd lost, about the guilt she'd carried, about the secret that had eaten away at her for decades. "I thought I was protecting myself," she said, "but I was really just protecting the man who killed my daughter. Lisa deserved better. She deserved justice. And thanks to David Keller, she finally got it." The night after Lisa's funeral, I had one final sleep paralysis episode, but this time it was different. David appeared to me, but he wasn't frustrated or desperate. He was peaceful. He stood at the foot of my bed, wearing his maintenance uniform, holding his toolbox. He looked at me and smiled, the first time I'd seen him smile. Then he nodded, as if to say, "Thank you," and walked toward the door. I never saw him again. The story didn't end with Lisa's funeral. The discovery of her body and the evidence in her notebook led to a much larger investigation. Detective Kim's team found connections to corrupt police officers, city officials, and business owners who've been part of Tony Marchetti's network. Several people were arrested, including a former police lieutenant who'd been protecting Tony in exchange for bribes. The investigation revealed a level of corruption that had allowed Tony to operate with impunity for years. Mrs. Chun decided to move out of the Hawthorne Arms. She said she couldn't stay in a place where she'd watched her daughter die. But before she left, she did something that surprised everyone. She had a small memorial plaque installed in the courtyard, where Lisa's body had been found. It read, "In memory of Lisa Chun, beloved daughter, and David Keller, who died trying to save her." The management company wasn't happy about it, but Detective Kim convinced them that it was the right thing to do. The courtyard was landscaped, turned into a small garden with benches where residents could sit and reflect. I still live in apartment 3C. I know that might seem strange, but I feel like I'm supposed to be there. Like David led me there for a reason. The building is different now. Quieter, more peaceful. The hallways don't feel oppressive anymore. The shadows don't seem to move on their own. But sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps in the hallway. Not the heavy, desperate footsteps of someone trying to communicate. These are lighter, more purposeful. Like someone making their rounds, checking on everyone, making sure they're safe. I think David Keller is still here, but he's not trapped anymore. He's chosen to stay, to watch over the building and its residents. He's finally at peace with what happened that night in 1987. Subscribe for more true paranormal stories. And remember, sometimes the dead are trying to help us solve the mysteries of the living. My name is Jennifer, and what I'm about to tell you happened last year while I was driving home from college for Thanksgiving break. I was a junior at the University of Oregon, studying psychology, and I'd always been skeptical of supernatural claims. I approached everything with a scientific mindset, looking for logical explanations. That all changed on a stretch of Highway 101 between Portland and my hometown of Astoria. I suffered from sleep paralysis occasionally, usually during stressful periods like finals week. It was always the same. I'd wake up unable to move, feel like someone was in the room with me. Then it would pass, and I'd go back to sleep. My psychology professors had explained it as a REM sleep disorder, nothing more. But on November 21st, 2024, I learned that sometimes sleep paralysis isn't just a disorder. Sometimes it's a warning. I'd left Eugene late in the evening, around 9 p.m. I was driving my mom's 2018 Honda Civic, a car I'd driven dozens of times before. The route was familiar. Take Highway 101 north along the coast, then cut inland toward Astoria. It should have been a 3-hour drive, getting me home around midnight. The first hour was normal. I had my playlist going. Windows cracked to stay alert. A large coffee from Dutch Brothers keeping me company. The coastal highway was mostly empty, with just the occasional trucker or late-night traveler. But as I approached a particularly remote section of the highway, about 60 miles south of Astoria, I started feeling strange. It wasn't tiredness. I was still wide awake. It was more like a heaviness in my chest, a sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake. I pulled over at a rest stop to collect myself. It was one of those small roadside areas with a few picnic tables and a single light pole. No bathrooms, no vending machines, just a place to stretch your legs. As I sat there, engine running, I decided to close my eyes for just a moment. That's when the sleep paralysis hit. I was conscious but couldn't move. I could hear the engine idling, feel the seat beneath me, smell the pine trees from the surrounding forest, but I couldn't open my eyes or move my fingers. And then I heard the voice. "Don't drive the canyon road tonight." It was a man's voice, older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. He spoke clearly, like he was sitting right next to me in the car. "There's ice on the bridge. You'll slide into the guardrail at mile marker 47. Your car will flip 3 times before it goes over the edge." I tried to respond, tried to move, but I was completely paralyzed. The voice continued. "Take Highway 30 instead. It's longer, but you'll make it home alive." The paralysis broke, and I gasped, looking around the empty rest stop. My heart was pounding, and I was covered in cold sweat. Highway 30 was indeed an alternate route to Astoria, but it would add at least an hour to my drive. I told myself it was just stress, just my subconscious mind processing the dangers of driving alone at night. But something about the voice had been so specific, so urgent. I made a decision that saved my life. I pulled out my phone and checked the route to Highway 30. It would take me inland, away from the coast, through small towns and farmland. The voice had been right. It would add about an hour to my trip. But as I sat there, trying to decide what to do, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard that voice before. Not recently, but sometime in the past. It was familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I decided to do some research. I pulled up the Oregon Department of Transportation website on my phone and looked up accident reports for Highway 101. What I found made my blood run cold. At mile marker 47, there have been 17 fatal accidents in the past 15 years. All of them involved cars sliding off the road and going over the guardrail into the canyon below. The most recent had been just 6 months earlier, a college student about my age, driving home for spring break. The conditions were always the same. Late night, black ice on the bridge, cars going too fast with conditions. The bridge was notorious among local residents, but the state had never installed adequate warning signs. I kept reading. One report from 2019 described a particularly horrific accident where a car had flipped 3 times before going over the edge. The exact words the voice had used. I started the car and headed toward Highway 30. As I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. The accent, the inflection, the way he'd said mile marker 47. It was all familiar. I'd heard before, but where? Then it hit me. My grandfather, Robert Thompson, had died when I was 12. He'd been a long-haul trucker for 40 years, driving routes all over the Pacific Northwest. He'd known every highway, every dangerous curve, every spot where accidents happened. And he'd had that same slight accent. Not quite Southern, not quite Western. It was a voice of someone who'd spent decades on the road, talking to truckers from all over the country. But my grandfather had been dead for 9 years. How could he be warning me about highway dangers? Highway 30 was indeed longer, but it was also safer. The road was well maintained, with good lighting and clear signage. As I drove, I kept thinking about my grandfather and wondering if I was losing my mind. Robert Thompson had been my favorite relative. While other grandparents told bedtime stories, he told stories about the road, about the time he'd driven through a blizzard in Montana, about the truck stop in Nevada, where he'd met my grandmother, about the accidents he'd seen, and the close calls he'd had. The road will talk to you if you know how to listen, he used to say. You just have to pay attention to what it's telling you. I'd always thought that was just trucker philosophy, the kind of wisdom that comes from spending your life on the highway. But now I wondered if he'd meant something more literal. Around 1 a.m., I stopped at a 24-hour diner in a small town called Rainier. I needed coffee and a chance to process what was happening. The diner was nearly empty, just me and a few truckers grabbing late-night meals. I ordered coffee and pie, sitting at a corner booth where I could think. That's when I overheard a conversation at the counter that made my heart race. Damn shame about that accident on 101 tonight. One trucker was saying, young girl, about college age, hit that bridge at mile marker 47, went right over the edge. I nearly choked on my coffee. I walked over to the counter. "Excuse me," I said. "Did you say there was an accident on Highway 101? The trucker looked at me with sympathy. "Yeah, honey, about 2 hours ago. Car hit black ice on that bridge. Flipped a few times before going over. Terrible thing. That spot's been claiming lives for years." I felt dizzy. If I'd stayed on Highway 101, if I hadn't listened to the voice, that would have been me. My grandfather had saved my life. But how was that possible? I made it home to Astoria around 2:30 a.m. My parents were already in bed, but I was too shaken to sleep. I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at a photo of my grandfather and me taken just a few months before he died. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. My mother was skeptical, but my father got a strange look on his face. "Your grandfather used to have dreams," he said, "about accidents before they happened. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was going to get hurt on a particular stretch of road." "What did he do about it?" "He'd call the highway patrol, report hazardous conditions. Sometimes he'd even drive to the spot himself just to check. The other truckers thought he was crazy, but they also respected him. He had a reputation for knowing things." My mother was listening intently now. "I remember those calls," she said. "He'd call at all hours, warning about ice or fog or deer crossings. The dispatchers knew him by name." "Did his warnings ever prevent accidents?" My father nodded. "More than once. There was one time, about a year before he died, when he had a dream about a school bus accident. He called the school district, told them not to take the usual route. They thought he was nuts, but they'd learned to trust him over the years. They took a different route, and later that day, a landslide blocked the road right where the bus would have been. I spent the rest of my Thanksgiving break researching my grandfather's history. I found dozens of incidents where he'd reported hazardous conditions or potential accidents. The highway patrol had a file on him, not as a troublemaker, but as someone who consistently provided accurate information about road dangers. But there was something else in the file. A report from a night my grandfather died. He'd been driving his usual route from Seattle to Portland when he'd had a heart attack. His truck had veered off the road and crashed into a tree. But before he died, he'd managed to call 911. The recording of that call was in the file. In it, my grandfather could be heard saying, "There's going to be a bad accident on Highway 101, mile marker 47. Black ice on the bridge. You need to put up warning signs." He died trying to prevent the same kind of accident that had almost killed me. My name is David, and I work as a security guard at a 30-story office building in downtown Seattle. I've been doing this job for 5 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. But last winter, I experienced something that changed my entire understanding of reality. I've always been a light sleeper, which makes me good at my job. I notice things other people miss, sounds, movements, anything out of place. But I also suffered from sleep paralysis, especially during the winter months when the days were short and the nights were long. The building I work in was constructed in 1987, a typical glass and steel structure with offices, a few restaurants on the ground floor, and a parking garage in the basement. During the day, it's bustling with activity, but at night, it's just me and the cleaning crew. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I make rounds every 2 hours, checking doors, monitoring security cameras, and making sure everything is secure. It's usually quiet work, the perfect job for someone who prefers solitude. But in December 2024, things started getting strange. It began with the elevators. They've been acting up for weeks, stopping at random floors, opening and closing their doors for no reason. The maintenance company had been out multiple times, but they couldn't find anything wrong with the system. Then I started noticing people working late, really late. I'd see lights on in offices at 3 a.m., shadows moving behind frosted glass. But when I checked the sign-in logs, no one was supposed to be in the building after 8 p.m. The first sleep paralysis episode happened during my break on December 15th. I was in the security office, feet up on the desk, when I dozed off. I woke up paralyzed, unable to move but fully conscious. That's when I heard typing. Not just one keyboard, but dozens of them. The sound was coming from the floor above me. the 23rd floor, which housed an accounting firm. But the 23rd floor should have been empty. I tried to move to get up and investigate, but I couldn't. The typing continued, rhythmic and urgent, like people working frantically to meet a deadline. When the paralysis broke, I immediately checked the security cameras for the 23rd floor. Empty. No movement, no lights, no people. But I could still hear the typing. I decided to investigate. I took the elevator to the 23rd floor, keys ready, flashlight in hand. The typing sound had stopped, but I could still feel something wrong about the floor. The accounting firm Morrison & Associates had been in the building for 15 years. They occupied the entire floor, with cubicles in the center and offices around the perimeter. During the day, it was a busy, productive workspace. At night, it should have been dead silent. I used my master key to enter the office. The space was dark, lit only by emergency lighting and the glow from the city below. I walked through the cubicles, checking each workstation. Everything looked normal. Computers turned off, desks cleared, chairs pushed in, but there was something in the air. A tension, like the feeling you get right before a thunderstorm. I was about to leave when I noticed something that made me stop. One of the computers was on. Not just on, it was displaying a spreadsheet with numbers scrolling down the screen faster than anyone could type them. I walked over to the computer. The screen showed financial data, but it was wrong. The dates were from 1987, but the formatting was modern. It was like someone was trying to recreate old records using current software. I touched the keyboard, and the screen went black. Over the next few nights, the episodes continued. I'd doze off during my break, experience sleep paralysis, and hear the typing. When I'd investigate, I'd find more computers displaying the same kind of data, financial record from 1987, but created with modern software. I started researching Morrison & Associates. The firm had been founded in 1985 by Thomas Morrison, a CPA who built a successful practice serving small businesses in the Seattle area. But there was something in the company's history that caught my attention. In 1987, the firm had been investigated by the IRS for tax fraud. The investigation had centered on a complex money laundering scheme involving several shell companies. But before the investigation could be completed, the key witness had died. The witness was a junior accountant named Sarah Mitchell. She'd been working late one night in December 1987 when she'd suffered a heart attack. She was only 28 years old. Sarah had been found at her desk the next morning, slumped over her computer, which was still displaying the evidence she'd been compiling against the firm. I found Sarah Mitchell's obituary in the Seattle Times archives. She'd been described as a dedicated employee who'd worked long hours to support her sick mother. Her death had been ruled natural, a heart attack brought on by stress and overwork. But there was something else in the obituary that made me think. Sarah had been working on a major audit the week she died. She'd been staying late every night, trying to reconcile discrepancies in the firm's books. The more I researched, the more suspicious Sarah's death became. She'd been young and healthy, with no history of heart problems. She'd been scheduled to meet with IRS investigators the day after she died. I decided to dig deeper into the firm's history. I found old employee records, newspaper articles about the IRS investigation, and court documents from the fraud case. The case had collapsed after Sarah's death. Without her testimony and the evidence she'd been compiling, the IRS couldn't prove their case. Thomas Morrison had been cleared of all charges, and the firm had continued operating. But several former employees had come forward years later, claiming that Sarah had been murdered. They said she'd been threatened by Morrison, that she'd been scared for her life in the weeks before her death. The police had investigated these claims, but they found no evidence of foul play. Sarah's death remained classified as natural. I started paying closer attention during my sleep paralysis episodes. Instead of fighting the paralysis, I listened, I observed, I tried to understand what was happening. During one episode, I heard more than just typing. I heard voices, people talking in urgent whispers, discussing numbers and dates and bank accounts. It sounded like a meeting, like people working together to solve a problem. When the paralysis broke, I immediately went to the 23rd floor. This time, I found more than just one computer turned on. An entire section of workstations was active, displaying different parts of what looked like a comprehensive financial audit. The data was complex, but I could see patterns. Money moving between accounts. Transactions that didn't make sense. Evidence of systematic fraud. It was like someone was recreating the audit that Sarah Mitchell had been working on when she died. I started photographing the screens during my investigations. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it was important. The financial data was detailed and specific, showing transactions from 1987 that painted a clear picture of money laundering and tax fraud. But I needed help interpreting what I was seeing. I contacted a friend of mine, Rebecca, who worked as a forensic accountant. I showed her the photos, without explaining how I'd obtained them. This is evidence of massive fraud. She said immediately. Someone was using shell companies to hide income, probably to avoid paying taxes. The amounts are huge, millions of dollars. How detailed would someone need to be to fake this kind of data? Rebecca studied the photos more carefully. You couldn't fake this level of detail, the way the transactions interconnect. This is real financial data. Someone with intimate knowledge of the scheme created this. I told her about Sarah Mitchell and the 1987 investigation. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. If this data existed in 1987, it would have been enough to send people to prison, she said. This is exactly the kind of evidence the IRS would have needed to prove their case. But Sarah died before she could present it. And now someone's recreating it. The question is why? I had a theory, but I knew Rebecca wouldn't believe it. Sarah Mitchell was still working, still trying to finish the audit that had killed her. She was using my sleep paralysis episodes to communicate, to show me what she discovered. But I needed more than just financial data. I needed to understand who had killed Sarah and why. My name is Patricia, and I work as a nurse on the night shift at Seattle General Hospital. I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I've seen death in all its forms. But what happened to me last summer challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundary between life and death. I'd been dealing with sleep paralysis for most of my adult life. It usually happened when I was stressed or overtired, which was often in my line of work. The episodes were always the same. I'd wake up unable to move, feeling like someone was in the room with me. Then it would pass after a few minutes. But in July 2024, during a particularly difficult stretch of shifts, the episodes changed. Instead of feeling threatened, I started feeling like the presence was trying to communicate with me. I was working in the ICU, caring for patients with severe injuries and illnesses. It's emotionally demanding work, and I've been pulling double shifts to help cover for colleagues who were out sick. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline. The first unusual episode happened during a break. I was in the staff restroom, trying to catch a few minutes of sleep before my next rounds. I dozed off in one of the recliners when the familiar paralysis set in. But this time, instead of feeling afraid, I felt calm. There was a presence in the room, but it wasn't threatening. It felt helpful. I heard a voice, soft and female, speaking with the kind of authority that comes from years of medical experience. Room 314. The voice said, "Check Mr. Harrison's 4 line. It's infiltrating." I knew the voice was talking about Albert Harrison, a 70-year-old patient who'd been admitted with pneumonia. He was stable, scheduled for discharge the next day. When the paralysis broke, I immediately went to room 314. Mr. Harrison was sleeping peacefully, but when I checked his 4 line, I found that it had infiltrated. The fluid was going into his tissue instead of his bloodstream. It was a minor problem, but it could have caused complications if left untreated. I fixed the 4 and made a note in his chart. Mr. Harrison never woke up, never knew that anything was wrong, but I knew that someone had been looking out for him. Over the next few weeks, the episodes continued. Each time, the voice would warn me about something, a patient whose condition was deteriorating, a medication error that needed to be caught, a family member who needed emotional support. The voice was always accurate. Every warning led to a problem that needed attention. Every suggestion resulted in better patient care. I started keeping a journal, documenting each episode and its outcome. The pattern was clear. Someone was helping me be a better nurse, helping me save lives. But I needed to understand who was communicating with me. I started researching the history of Seattle General Hospital. The building had been constructed in 1962, and it had seen thousands of patients over the decades. But I was looking for something specific, a nurse who might have a connection to the ICU. I found what I was looking for in the hospital's memorial wall. Among the dozens of plaques honoring deceased staff members, one caught my attention. Margaret Sullivan, RN 1955 to 1993, dedicated ICU nurse for 25 years. Her compassion and expertise saved countless lives. Margaret Sullivan had worked in the same ICU where I was now employed. She died in 1993, just a few months before her retirement, from complications following surgery. I found colleagues who had worked with Margaret. They all described her the same way, an exceptional nurse who seemed to have a sixth sense about patient care. She could predict which patients were going to take a turn for the worse, which medications might cause problems, which families needed extra support. Margaret had a gift, one retired nurse told me. She could walk into a room and immediately know what was wrong. She saved more lives than any nurse I've ever worked with. The voice I'd been hearing sounded exactly like the descriptions of Margaret Sullivan, soft but authoritative, filled with medical knowledge and compassion. I decided to test my theory. During my next sleep paralysis episode, I tried to communicate with the voice. "Margaret?" I whispered in my mind. "Are you Margaret Sullivan?" The voice was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, dear. I've been trying to help you. You're a good nurse, but you're exhausted. You need to trust your instincts more. Why are you here? Why are you helping me?" "The patients need us," Margaret said. "Death isn't the end of caring. I spent my life in this ICU, and I'm not ready to leave. These people need someone watching over them." Over the next few months, Margaret became my mentor. During each episode, she'd share her knowledge, her experience, her insights about patient care. She taught me to notice subtle changes in breathing patterns, to recognize the early signs of infection, to provide comfort to families facing loss. But Margaret wasn't just helping me. She was helping all the patients in the ICU. I started noticing things during my regular rounds that I'd never seen before. Patients would have sudden improvements that couldn't be explained medically. Families would find comfort in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Equipment would mysteriously start working again after being broken. The ICU had always been a place of healing, but now it felt like something more. It felt like a place where the boundary between life and death was thin, where caring continued even after the caregiver was gone. One night in September, I had an episode that was different from all the others. Margaret's voice was urgent, almost panicked. "Patricia, you need to go to room 307 immediately. Mrs. Chun is in cardiac arrest." I'd never heard Margaret sound scared before. When the paralysis broke, I ran to room 307. Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, was indeed in cardiac arrest. Her heart monitor was flatlining, and she wasn't breathing. I immediately called a code blue and started CPR. The resuscitation team arrived within minutes, and we managed to get her heart beating again. Mrs. Chin survived, made a full recovery, and was discharged 2 weeks later. But here's what haunted me. Mrs. Chen's heart had stopped silently. Her monitors hadn't alerted us because of a technical malfunction. Without Margaret's warning, Mrs. Chun would have died. I realized that Margaret wasn't just helping me learn to be a better nurse. She was actively saving lives, using me as her connection to the physical world. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead it was comforting. Margaret had dedicated her life to caring for others, and death hadn't stopped her from continuing that mission. I started leaving small offerings in the break room, a cup of coffee, a flower from the hospital garden, a thank you note. I never saw them disappear, but they were always gone by the next shift. Other nurses started noticing changes in the ICU. Patient outcomes improved, families felt more supported, and the general atmosphere became more positive. They attributed it to better teamwork, improved protocols, enhanced training. But I knew the truth. Margaret Sullivan was still on duty, still caring for her patients, still making a difference. My name is Robert, and I work as a custodian at Lincoln High School in Tacoma, Washington. I've been cleaning these hallways for 8 years, and I thought I knew every corner of this building. But last fall, I discovered that some parts of the school held secrets that went back decades. I've always been a person who pays attention to details. You have to be in my line of work. You notice when things are out of place, when someone's been somewhere they shouldn't have been, when something's not right. I also suffer from sleep paralysis, usually during the fall semester, when the workload is heaviest. It's not pleasant, but I've learned to deal with it. I'd wake up unable to move, feel like someone was watching me. Then it would pass, and I'd go back to sleep. But in October 2024, during my lunch break, I had an episode that was different from all the others. I was resting in the custodial office, a small room in the basement where I keep my supplies and equipment. I'd been working since 6 a.m., cleaning classrooms and preparing for the day ahead. I was tired, so I decided to close my eyes for a few minutes. The paralysis hit me harder than usual. I couldn't move, couldn't open my eyes, couldn't speak. But I could hear something that made my blood run cold. Crying. A young person crying. Somewhere in the building. The sound was coming from above me, somewhere on the main floor. It was heartbreaking. The kind of crying that comes from deep pain, from desperation. I tried to move, to go help whoever was in distress. But I couldn't. I was trapped, listening to someone's agony. Then I heard a voice, older male, speaking in a gentle tone. "It's okay, son. You're not alone. I'm here with you." "I can't take it anymore," the young voice replied. "Everyone hates me. I don't want to be here anymore." "I know it feels that way," the older voice said, "but it gets better. You just have to hold on." The conversation continued, with the older voice providing comfort and encouragement to the younger one. It sounded like a counselor talking to a student, but school wasn't in session yet. It was only 7 a.m. when the paralysis broke. I immediately went upstairs to investigate. The main floor was empty, just as it should have been, but I could still hear the faint sound of crying, coming from the direction of the guidance counselor's office. I found the guidance counselor's office locked, but I could see light coming from under the door. I used my master key to open it, expecting to find a student who'd somehow gotten into the building early. The office was empty. No counselor, no student, no sign that anyone had been there. But there was something on the desk that made me pause, a file folder with a student's name on it. Michael Torres. I'd never heard of Michael Torres, but the file looked old, dated from the 1990s. I opened it and found records of a student who'd been struggling academically and socially. There were notes about bullying, family problems, and depression. The last entry in the file was dated November 15th, 1995. It was a note from the guidance counselor, a man named Harold Whitman, expressing concern about Michael's mental state and recommending immediate intervention. But there was no follow-up. The file just ended. I did some research in the school's archives. Michael Torres had been a junior at Lincoln High School in 1995. He'd been an average student, but he'd been dealing with serious problems at home and at school. According to his records, he'd been absent frequently in the weeks before November 15th. On November 16th, 1995, Michael Torres had taken his own life. He'd hung himself in the school's basement utility room, just down the hall from where I now kept my office. Harold Whitman, the guidance counselor, had been devastated by Michael's death. He'd blamed himself for not doing more to help. According to school records, Whitman had worked at Lincoln for another 10 years after Michael's death, but colleagues described him as a changed man, haunted by the loss of a student he'd tried to save. Whitman had died of a heart attack in 2010, 5 years after his retirement. His obituary mentioned his dedication to helping troubled students and his lasting grief over the ones he couldn't save. Over the next few weeks, I had several more episodes. Each time, I'd hear the same conversation. Harold Whitman trying to comfort Michael Torres, trying to convince him that life was worth living. But I also started noticing things during my regular work. I'd find notes in the guidance office, written in handwriting that didn't match any current staff member. The notes were advice for dealing with troubled students, suggestions for intervention strategies, warnings about kids who were showing signs of depression or suicidal ideation. The current guidance counselor, Ms. Rodriguez, was puzzled by the notes. She'd find them on her desk in the morning, always relevant to a student she was working with, always helpful. "It's like someone's been reading my case files," she told me. "These notes are incredibly insightful. They're exactly what I need to help these kids." I started paying closer attention to the students, looking for signs of the problems that Harold Whitman was apparently still trying to address. I found several kids who seemed to be struggling, isolated, bullied, showing signs of depression. During one of my episodes, I heard Harold's voice more clearly than ever before. "There's a student in room 237, he said. "Jenny Martinez. She's been cutting herself. She needs help." When the paralysis broke, I immediately went to find Ms. Rodriguez. I couldn't tell her about the supernatural communication, so I said I'd noticed that Jenny seemed depressed and isolated. Ms. Rodriguez met with Jenny that same day. She found the cut marks on Jenny's arms and was able to get her the help she needed. Jenny's parents were contacted. She was referred to a therapist, and she started getting the support she needed to deal with her depression. Jenny Martinez then became another Michael Torres. As the school year progressed, I realized that Harold Whitman was using me as his connection to the current students. He was still trying to be a guidance counselor, still try to save the kids he couldn't reach in life. I started leaving Harold's old files in places where Ms. Rodriguez would find them. I'd accidentally leave them on her desk, in her mailbox, in places where she'd noticed them. The files contained insights about student behavior, warning signs of depression, and intervention strategies that had been developed over decades of experience. Ms. Rodriguez started implementing some of Harold's old techniques. She became more proactive about identifying troubled students, more skilled at providing support to kids who were struggling. The school's suicide prevention program improved dramatically, but Harold wasn't just helping current students. He was also trying to find peace for himself. During one episode, I heard him talking to Michael Torres about forgiveness. "I should have done more," Harold said. "I should have seen how much you were hurting." "You did everything you could," Michael replied. "I made my choice. It wasn't your fault." "I've been carrying this guilt for so long," Harold said. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently." "You've helped so many kids since then," Michael said. "You've saved lives. That's what matters." I realized that Harold and Michael were both trapped by what had happened in 1995. Harold by his guilt, Michael by his despair. But by working together to help current students, they were both finding a way to heal. As winter approached, I started noticing connections between all the supernatural encounters I've been having through my sleep paralysis. They weren't random events. They were all related to unfinished business, to people who died with important work left undone. David Keller, the maintenance worker, had died trying to expose a murder. Margaret Sullivan had died before she could finish her career as a nurse. Harold Whitman had died carrying the guilt of a student he couldn't save. They were all still working, still try to complete their missions, but there was something else connecting them. They were all using people with sleep paralysis as a way to communicate with the living world. The paralysis wasn't just a neurological disorder. It was a state where the boundary between life and death became thin enough for the deceased to reach through. I started researching sleep paralysis from a different perspective. Instead of looking at it as a medical condition, I looked at it as a form of supernatural communication. What I found was fascinating. Throughout history, people had reported similar experiences. In many cultures, sleep paralysis was considered a form of spiritual communication, a way for the dead to contact the living. The scientific explanation was relatively recent. For most of human history, people had understood sleep paralysis as something supernatural. Maybe the scientists were wrong. Maybe sleep paralysis wasn't just a glitch in REM sleep. Maybe it was exactly what people had always believed it to be, a doorway between worlds. I decided to conduct an experiment. During my next episode, instead of being passive, I tried to actively communicate with Harold Whitman. "Harold," I said in my mind, "I want to help you. What do you need me to do?" His response was immediate and clear. "There's going to be another student like Michael, a boy named Tyler, in room 134. He's planning to hurt himself this weekend. You need to stop him." Tyler Chin was a sophomore I'd seen around the school, but never really noticed. He was quiet, kept to himself, didn't cause any trouble. But when I started paying attention, I could see the signs that Harold had trained me to recognize. Tyler was isolated, had no friends, was often the target of bullying. He'd been absent frequently in recent weeks. And when he was at school, he looked exhausted and depressed. I couldn't approach Tyler directly. As a custodian, I had limited interaction with students. But I could alert Ms. Rodriguez. I've noticed a student who seems to be struggling. I told her, Tyler Chun. He's been absent a lot, and when he's here, he looks really down. Ms. Rodriguez checked Tyler's records. His grades had been dropping. His teachers had reported that he seemed disengaged, and he'd been sent to principal's office twice for getting into fights with bullies. She called Tyler into her office that afternoon. What she found confirmed Harold's warning. Tyler was indeed planning to hurt himself. He'd been researching suicide methods online, had written notes to his family, and was planning to end his life that weekend. Ms. Rodriguez was able to get Tyler the help he needed. His parents were contacted. He was referred to a therapist, and he was placed on a safety plan. Most importantly, he was surrounded by people who cared about him and wanted to help. Tyler Chin didn't become another Michael Torres. As the school year continued, I had fewer sleep paralysis episodes. It was as if Harold Whitman had found the peace he'd been searching for. He'd been able to prevent another tragedy, to save a student in a way he hadn't been able to save Michael Torres. But I still heard from him occasionally, usually when there was a student who needed help. He'd become my invisible partner in keeping the school safe and identifying kids who were struggling before it was too late. The other spirits seemed to have found peace as well. David Keller had successfully led to the discovery of Lisa Chen's body, bringing justice to a case that had been cold for decades. Margaret Sullivan continued to help in the ICU, but her communications were less frequent, more focused on genuine emergencies. I realized that all of these spirits had been trapped by unfinished business, by work they'd left undone when they died, by helping them complete their missions, by serving as their connection to the living world. I'd helped them find peace. But more than that, I'd learned something important about the nature of death and the purpose of life. Death doesn't end our responsibilities. It just changes how we fulfill them. The desire to help others, to make a difference, to leave the world better than we found it. These things transcend the physical body. Sleep paralysis, I now understood, wasn't a disorder to be cured. It was a gift, an ability to communicate with those who'd gone before us. It was a way for the living and the dead to work together, to complete the important work of caring for each other. My experiences with sleep paralysis and supernatural communication led me to research similar cases around the world. What I found was remarkable. There were thousands of people reporting similar experiences, all involving spirits trying to complete unfinished business. A police officer in Chicago who solved cold cases through information received during sleep paralysis episodes. A doctor in London who saved lives based on warnings from deceased colleagues. A teacher in Tokyo who prevented student suicides through guidance from spirits of former educators. The pattern was always the same: people with sleep paralysis serving as conduits for spirits who had important work left undone. The medical community dismissed these reports as hallucinations or coincidences, but the evidence was overwhelming. I started a support group for people with sleep paralysis, but not the usual kind. This was a group for people who'd had supernatural experiences during their episodes, who'd been contacted by spirits trying to communicate. The group grew quickly. We shared our experiences, learned from each other, and developed techniques for better communication with the spirits who were trying to reach us. We called ourselves the Bridge Society because we serve as bridges between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Through our work, we helped solve crimes, prevented suicide, saved lives, and brought peace to troubled spirits. We became a network of people dedicated to helping both the living and the dead complete their important work. Today, I continue to work as a custodian at Lincoln High School, but I also serve as a coordinator for the Bridge Society. We now have members in 12 countries, all people who've learned to use their sleep paralysis as a tool for supernatural communication. Harold Whitman still contacts me occasionally, usually when there's a student who needs help. But his communications are calmer now, more focused on guidance than on urgent warnings. He's found peace in knowing that he's still making a difference, still protecting the students he cares about. I've learned that death is not the end of our capacity to help others. It's just a change in how we provide that help. The spirits who contact us through sleep paralysis are proof that love, compassion, and the desire to serve others transcend the physical world. If you suffer from sleep paralysis, I encourage you to approach it differently. Instead of fighting the paralysis, listen to what's being communicated. Pay attention to the voices, the visions, the feelings you experience. You might be receiving important information from someone who has urgent work to complete. The next time you experience sleep paralysis, remember that you're not alone. You're part of a network of people who serve as bridges between worlds, who help ensure that important work continues even after death. And if you hear a voice during your paralysis, if you see a figure trying to communicate with you, don't dismiss it as a hallucination. Listen carefully. Someone might be trying to tell you something that could save a life. The dead don't rest until their work is done. And sometimes, they need our help to complete it. Have you experienced supernatural communication during sleep paralysis? Share your story in the comments below. You might be helping someone who needs to complete their final mission. Remember to subscribe for more true paranormal stories. And always listen to what the shadows are trying to tell you. Because in the space between sleep and waking, between life and death, important messages are waiting to be heard. The spirits are counting on us to listen.